Hello, everybody. This is Antonio Wolf, and would you look at that? That is a face which anybody can love. That just looks like a kind old man. Like, that could be a Santa Claus. Uh, so could Robert Brandon. Robert Brandon more so than Pippin. But anyways, today we are going to do something far more interesting than usual. If you're not aware of Robert Pippin is a very famous Anglo-Hegelian scholar. I don't know why Pippin isn't included in the analytic, quote-unquote, revival of Hegel, because he's kind of part of it, really. Him, Pinkard, Robert Brandon, McDowell. Brandon and McDowell far more so than Pinkard and Pippin, but particularly Pinkard and Pippin are or were known as the Kantian readers of Hegel, who see Hegel as going forward with and finishing, so to say, Kant's project. I have never been a fan of that reading. That reading is just patently bullshit. I'll just say that. Fine. If they're doing their own thing, it's totally cool that, so they can take Hegel and do whatever the fuck it is that they want. Just don't say that, you're doing Hegel as Hegel. And that's about it. But anyways, the interesting thing is here is this was late last year at a online conference for the British Hegel Society. And Pippin gave a talk, which was very, very strange, because it is not a talk. It is a talk related to Hegel, but it's a critique of Hegel from a Heideggerian standpoint. And it's been quite a few years since Pippin has been intimating that he has had doubts about Hegelianism. Particularly from the standpoint of Heidegger, in which even I think about 5 years ago I saw some lecture in which he mentioned it somewhere around the lecture about how he had intuitions that Heidegger had something going on that Hegel didn't, but that rationally speaking he could not comprehend how Heidegger could possibly be doing something else that Hegel didn't. And it seems now he has come to the point, at least in this talk, in which he seems fairly confident that Heidegger indeed is doing something Hegel couldn't. And so we will see if he convinces us to abandon Hegel and to follow Heidegger, to go walk into a nice little cabin in the woods, into a nice little clearing, and just be. All right, starting.
Let's see what happens. The talk has 5 sections after 10 or 15 minute introduction, so I'll announce the sections so you know how close we are to being over. So in the last book of his Science of Logic, The Logic of the Concept, Hegel treats the concept of organic life in nature as a pure or logical concept. In his account, this means that we know non-empirically that there is an ontological distinction between living and non-living beings, and we know what this difference consists in. We know it as a result of a general reflection on what is involved in self-consciously judging anything to be the case, somewhat more broadly, in the rendering of any object or event intelligible. Formulated differently, we know there must be such a distinction as a result of a general reflection on the possibility of any beings being just what it is, and not anything else. These accounts, a general reflection on the possibility of self-consciously judging anything to be the case, and the possibility of any beings being the being it is, and not something else.
So this talk of possibility is the whole. There's definitely a Kantian thing. Like, Kantians are obsessed with the conditions for the possibility of X. Like, this is a typical way of, people who talk from that transcendental standpoint, which annoys me.
it's unscientific. You have to presuppose a distinction.
Just pointed that out.
Else are identical in Hegel. There are not really two accounts, but one, expressible in two modalities. This means that any account of what it is to judge self-consciously about objects that did not make possible a priori a distinction between living and non-living beings would be incomplete and therefore inadequate. If restricted to empirical experience alone, we could make no categorical difference between an iron blade rusting in the moist air and a plant withering and dying for lack of water. Explaining the two events empirically would have the same logical form, and for Hegel, this is equivalent to saying the events have the same form, and they do not. Hegel rejects this identification. In the latter case, the plant is said not to agree with its concept, not to be functioning as a plant should, and that involves a different logical form. This is something that cannot be said about a rusting blade and is the basis of the claim for the problem, for the insufficiency, the lack of a distinction. There's nothing about oxidation in moist air that is necessary for the iron to be iron. It's iron whether it's rusting or not. The form is not a heuristic for organizing the results of empirical observation and not regulative in the Kantian sense, and so not subjective in the Kantian sense. There is a real difference between living and non-living beings, knowable a priori. And that is why we are able to distinguish them. We need the distinction because there is a distinction. This is a conceptual truth. Heidegger, on the contrary, denies that the way life is understood or is available to us is as a concept, a content of a priori thought. And in doing so, he treats Hegel as paradigmatic for the approach of all Western philosophy itself, which he calls a forgetful and unsustainable approach. So there is a great deal at stake between them in what I will call a contrast between a phenomenological approach to living being and a logical approach. It's clear how much is at stake for Heidegger in his 1927 lecture course on the basic problems of phenomenology, where he sets out his fundamental difference with Hegel. This crude sketch of the fate of logic is intended to indicate that because the problem of the copula, the is treated in logic, as in there is a living being, it necessarily gets detached from the truly relevant problems of philosophy as the science of being. The problem will make no further progress as long as logic itself has not been taken back again into ontology, as long as Hegel, who in contrast dissolved ontology into logic, is not comprehended. And this means always that Hegel must be overcome by radicalizing the way in which the problem is put. And at the same time, he must be appropriated. The overcoming of Hegel is intrinsically the necessary step in the development of Western philosophy, which must be made for it to remain at all alive. Whether logic can successfully be made into philosophy again, we do not know. Philosophy should not prophesy, but then again, it should not remain asleep. This passage restates a concern of Heidegger's with what he calls logic that occupied him throughout the 1920s and the early 1930s. In terms of the topic of this essay, their respective treatments of organic being or natural life, the charge can be put, at least initially, very simply. As Heidegger sees it, the problem is that Hegel understands life as a pure concept, and this within a systematic account of the pure concepts necessary in rendering intelligible any being, and any being being intelligibly what it is. Hegel is said to reanimate, by Heidegger, to the Platonic Aristotelian logical ontology, which holds that to be is to be intelligible in principle, knowable, and all that there is in principle knowable. This means that we can study being itself by studying the logic of predication and inference, the basic acts of rendering intelligible. Now, as you all know, Hegel doesn't think Aristotle has the right account of this rendering and is tied to the logic of Verstand, and Heidegger has his own speculative account of logic, but that does not affect, I think, Heidegger's point. For Hegel, especially as Heidegger understands him, this certainly did not mean what many, including Hegel, took Kant to mean, that the project determining the necessary elements of intelligibility limited the results of such a project to our conceptual scheme. and so determined the intelligibles, the knowables, as available only as appearances, not things in themselves, beings only insofar as they were available to finite, restricted, and even provincial human knowers. For Hegel, again as Heidegger understood him, to be is necessarily to be determinate, a this such, discriminable from any other such, and the requirements of determinacy were also the requirements for anything to count as a being. Anything putatively indeterminate, an object, an event, a state of affairs, a meaning, being, that cannot be distinguished from anything else as what it is, isn't anything. The beginning of wisdom for the early Heidegger is that, on the contrary, there clearly was, just as a first point, a being not at all comprehensible as, not at all being determinate, the being human being, which Heidegger called Dasein, precisely to indicate that it was not a determinate this such. Dasein is and is only openness to the meaning of being itself, being there, at the site of any manifestation of such meaning. There could be no logos in the Hegelian sense to a being, Dasein, that was whatever it took itself to be, a being whose mode of being is exclusively to be, existence, as Heidegger says, a possibility.
See, this strikes me as just bullshit, because it's clearly ignoring what the intelligibility of determinacy and indeterminacy and existence are for Hegel. Which, I don't know, it seems to me Heidegger's not stupid. He would know that this is the case. And he's purposely ignoring it. Oh, he says, oh, well, there is an indeterminate being. Well, good, you've proven Hegel's point. It's determinately indeterminate. Yeah, that's how it is, the kind of thing that it is.
Yeah, indetermination is its determinacy.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, and I don't even know if Pippin's being accurate to Heidegger even right now. That's not even clear to me, but just that picture of Dasein as completely indeterminate, and so determinacy, given that, must come from without, from outside, so to speak. So this is
Hello?
This has to be bare sensation, but he's going to give it way more than that. I don't even know.
Yeah.
It's just muddled. It's so muddled already. It's crazy.
It just doesn't make any sense to me to put that in the way that he just did. And by the way, yes, we can hear you, Pedro.
Yeah.
Because what he wants to say, and what I think Heidegger wants to say, is Dasein just is that process of being. It's the process, as I'm understanding. I'm not. I can't say that Heidegger does or does not really see this, but what I'm understanding from this so far is for Dasein. Dasein is just that. It's the process of the coming into being of things. So it's it's how beings being. And to put that in, and what he put right now, it's let me go back a little bit.
Especially not one whose mode of being, according to be, existence, as Heidegger says, a possibility, a self-interpreting being. Especially not one whose mode of being, according to Heidegger, is to be constantly faced with its own non-being, the possibility of the random, arbitrary end of its being in death.
Yeah, there's an echo from you, Rain. Maybe set your voice threshold higher. I mean, Dasein's supposed to be indeterminate, right? And yet here he is giving determinacies as to what Dasein is as an indeterminate being. I don't know. That's just contradictory to me.
I think from what I've noticed from reading a bit of Heidegger his whole point is that thinking is not autonomous. There is no possibility of autonomy to thinking because there is being, and being is what gives thinking what it thinks. You see? So there is this being which gives thought to thinking. You see? So there is always this structure of a fundamental externality in which thought becomes subordinated by this being which gives thought to thinking, but it cannot fully present itself to thought, you know? What I understood of Heidegger is basically this. So it is a philosophy of heteronomy. It is a philosophy of externality, a philosophy which denies any kind of autonomous activity to thought in the last instance, you know. So there is
Yeah,
this
yeah, that's certainly the case.
being which is what words he uses? He uses unveilment, right? So this being is eternally not synchronically, but diachronically unveiling itself to thought without ever being fully comprehended within thought. And that's one of the reasons, I guess, that he calls Hegel's philosophy a metaphysics of presence, right? Because uh, Hegel's philosophy tried to presentify being in its full character to thought, in thought, within thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, maybe he certainly misreads Hegel. I know that for sure. But I mean, as one thing to point out is Hegel does not give a fuck about being. Being is the poorest thought, the poorest thing to Hegel. So Hegel has no veneration towards it. That's the same way that Heidegger does. But anyways, let's keep this going.
Please.
Such a being could never simply be what it is. But this was only the beginning of a larger claim, most associated with Heidegger, that the meaning of being itself would be forever hidden, even forgotten, if Hegel's views about the infinity of pure thinking, there being nothing outside the conceptually determinable, were accepted. Being would be rendered a determinate object like any other, a position which would itself assume and not account for the meaning of being itself. Much more on this as we go on. It would presume an understanding of the meaning of being in what Heidegger calls an ontology, a being which again would presuppose rather than address the possible meaningfulness of being as such. Further down the road in the Hegelian development, as we'll see, the same is true, according to Heidegger, of life as Hegel understands it. There is no good way to state this beginning opposition between them without the rather insular terminology of Heidegger. So the first task here is to show and explain in more detail that this is how Heidegger understood Hegel. Secondly, to show, much more controversially, that in general he's right about Hegel. Third, how in the...
Shots fired.
Yeah, definitely.
Hegel understands life as a pure concept. Fourth, what is Heidegger's contrasting view of the mode of being and the availability of living beings of organic life. With such large abstractions in play, 5, the account will have to be sketchy, but it will, I hope, allow a brief assessment of Heidegger's position. So, section 1, Heidegger's Hegel. For our purposes, the discussion that's especially important is what was published as the second part of Identity and Difference, 1955-57, originally the end of a seminar and also later a lecture called the Onto-Theological Constitution of Metaphysics. This is because Heidegger goes immediately and directly to the heart of Hegel's enterprise and states it, in my view, accurately as just what it is, or at least I try to show elsewhere in general why it's accurate. Heidegger tells us that the subject matter, the Sache of thinking for Hegel, is thinking as such, denken als solches. This is quite right, and I think still absent from many other substantivist or objectivist accounts of the logic. The science of logic is unambiguously said to be the science of pure thinking. And Heidegger notes how comprehensive is Hegel's ambition. In order not to misinterpret this definition of the matter, thinking as such, in psychological or epistemological terms, we must add by way of explanation, thinking as such in the developed fullness in which what has been thought has been and now is thought. Welcome to Heideggerese. Heidegger rightly focuses on the Hegelian claim that logic, properly understood, is metaphysics. The thinking of pure thinking is at the same time the thinking of the world in its thinkability, as it is in itself. He reminds us that we can only understand this from Kant's viewpoint, although not like Kant, transcendentally, but, as Hegel says, speculative. That is, Hegel thinks thinking self-determination as the logic of being. Hegel thinks thinking self-determination is the logic of being and not a subjective epistemological condition. Heidegger realizes that pure thinking's taking itself as an object does not result in a mere theory of thinking or the rules of thinking or a philosophy of pure cognition. As Heidegger says directly and correctly, for Hegel, quote, being is the absolute self-thinking of thinking, unquote. The last thing Heidegger means by that is that being is mental activity, whether human or divine. That would merely be an account of one of the beings, a subject matter of one of the special sciences, and would again presuppose a general logic of possible intelligibility. Because of his own approach, Heidegger is in a unique position to realize that the subject matter...
Okay, I think everything up to that final point about this ending up being merely about mental activity is pretty spot on and fair.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, they did.
yeah, except that final distinction, like that the logic is only about mental activity. That it can't be.
Yeah, they presupposed an epistemological reading of the science of logic when it's exactly from indeterminacy, or that you're supposed to begin. Otherwise, you're like, oh, my mental activity, that's what this is about, versus other things that I've already presupposed. You have to develop all of those distinctions. You don't get to just set them up and then, wow, I have a problem, just because you set up a problem immediately.
Yeah, because that frames it in the terms of a theory of cognition. And certainly it has a place as in theories of cognition. But it is not a theory of cognition as such. It's a theory of thought.
Yeah.
It's a theory.
What I think
yeah, go ahead.
amazes me in this kind of arguing is that all of it is being made within thought itself. So even when you appeal to something which is out of thought, if you are claiming that it is something determinate, or in other words, something which is different from other somethings, you are already employing thought categories to characterize it, and to characterize it in an ontological way, right? So what I don't understand is how people cannot understand that there is no out of thought, right? You can't think.
Yep. Sorry.
You can think, for example, you can think without assuming consciousness, for instance, as a fundamental structure for philosophy, but you cannot think philosophy without the concept. So, I mean, if there is something out of thought, it could present itself within thought, even for, I mean, if there is something out of thinking, that something would be a eternally mysterious to us, in the sense that it could not present itself even to say that it is out of thinking, you know?
Exactly.
That,
That's the big problem. That these people want to say something, though there is some kind of thing that's beyond thought, and it's so beyond thought that it can't even be present to thought. You know, it's or at least it. Being fair, they don't usually say that. What they said is thought can't grasp it fully. You know, somehow there is a beyond. But that itself is an intelligible determination about what the whole thing is. So, you know, in being beyond and being understood as being beyond, it still nonetheless falls right back in.
yeah, and there is another problem there. For you to say that something is beyond another something, you need to have already crossed this limit. I think one interesting metaphor for that is that if our will, take for example the concept of will, right? If our will were naturally determined, we wouldn't be able to will out of this natural determination. So we wouldn't be able to know that our will is limited by this natural determination. You know, it's just like being completely submerged in certain cultural assumptions. People who are actually submerged in certain cultural assumptions would not bring up to consciousness those specific cultural assumptions. In the moment that you actually bring up to your consciousness certain cultural assumptions, you are already establishing yourself out of them. You cannot look at something if you are in a certain sense out of it. You know, so I really wish this Heideggerian turn to finitude, to the idea of a being which is never present to thought, to the idea of a thought which is forever being dependent of a gift from being. I wish that could be like, that could make sense to me, but it never did, you know? I always felt Heidegger was kind of a philosophy of absolute slavery, you know, the most fundamental philosophy of slavery, the most coherent and well-established philosophy of conservatism, you know, because if our thinking, if the contents of our thought are determined from the outside, the contents of thought, I mean, not our thought. I don't want to give it a subjective spin here. If the content of thought itself is determined by something which is out of thought, that means that our thought is conditioned and is relative to that particular determiner, right? So that means that we will think whatever being gives us. And I think this whole idea of fleeing the possibility of autonomy can only lead us to a certain traditionalist quietism. And that's exactly what Heidegger did with his life, you know? Like, I want to be clear here that what I'm saying is based on my experience on Heidegger. I never took the man seriously, but I took lectures on him, pretty good lectures on him. And I'm talking specifically about his claim that being gives thinking its thought. You know, this structure of externality, if people don't understand that, I think it's better to focus here on the consequences of such a fundamental heteronomy, you know? And there are a lot of philosophies of heteronomy. You have the unconscious bullshit of Lacan. You have the empiricist claim that thinking is only a formal, empty entity which depends on something else to give its own to give it content. There is a lot of philosophies of externality, philosophies of heteronomy, but for me, Heidegger has the merit of at least establishing the most fundamental exposition, the most clear and logical exposition of the logic of radical heteronomy. Radical heteronomy. And that will lead to some kind of traditionalist position in the end, or that will lead to some kind of convictionalist philosophy in which you believe that you are doing that because you are receiving a gift from this mysterious, never-present being who's making you think that, and you are only listening and doing. So either conservatives or progressists, let's say, they're both only like puppets of being. There is no such a criteria to differentiate themselves. Once I asked my teacher, she's a very good teacher on Heidegger. Well, teacher, and what about the forgetfulness of being? Isn't it a gift from being itself? And she had a laugh on me, and she didn't answer me. She just laughed and continued with her work, But that question is a pretty, because Heidegger seems to have like a certain criteria of condemnation of philosophy, but I really don't know where he takes that from, because if he is making a clear description of thought as something subordinate to being and something forever subordinate to being, that means that the whole history of Western philosophy and its forgetfulness of being is itself a consequence of the contents that being provided or have gifted thought with,
Yeah. I don't know that Heidegger really can be. We can really say that Heidegger is like the clearest exposition of this logic that is ultimately a logic of slavery, because it's another determination. But certainly he's one of the forerunners of what led to an explosion of the philosophies of otherness, which dominated and still somewhat dominate the continental tradition for the most part. But yes, what was it? Yeah, the claim that the logic concerns merely a theory of a type of being called thought, just does not fit. Because within the logic, this isn't determined actually until later in spirit, really, or at least from the standpoint of nature. That thought appears as a being, particularly the universal, as opposed to the particular. But that's only excuse me. That is only from the immediacy of that beginning. In the end, this abstract universal, and this is pretty fitting. Sure, at the beginning, the logic starts out, even when we complete it, compared to all these things, it's just the abstract universal set of determinations of thought. Or Winfield puts it in this language as well, which Hegel also does, by the way. It's literally right there in the text. The logic is not merely a theory of intelligibility. It's not merely it's a theory of determinacy. Yeah. This can be a determinacy of thought, can be a determinacy of being, can be a determinacy of anything. It is universal.
Yeah.
And because it is universal, I mean, it is just the structures and dynamics of anything that could possibly be, including the very thing in which it is not yet a determinate being, because the logic is not yet a determinate anything in the usual sense of existence that we talk about. It's determinate within itself. It has its full set of logical determinations, but it's not determined as logic versus, say, nature. It's not determined as logic versus spirit. But at the end of the system, logic overcomes the distinction of nature and spirit and subsumes them once again, because where does all this happen ultimately? Where does this all make sense? In thought, to thought, for thought.
Yeah.
And maybe people don't like that terminology, that thought. Maybe they want to say being. Fine, call it whatever you want. It makes no difference. Like the main reason it's called thought is because, well, it's an immaterial living dynamic, so it's not just some kind of substance or whatever. There is a both an objective and a subjective element in the ways that we normally use thought. So it's kind of fitting to call that thought. But if you want to call it being, then sure, it's being. It's not just thought. One of the strange things about this desire to reduce this to a mere cognitive theory, it acts as if thought is not, as if thought is some kind of other being to being. How's that going to make sense? It's no different than you thinking that your experience, your qualitative consciousness, is somehow different. It is in the being it is to the general being of anything else. It's active being is just like all the other things. Everything is. So if there's going to be an access to being, thought must have that access to being. How could it not? And we know that the reason thought would have an access to more than just its particular being, well, it's because it's a fucking universal being. A piece of rock does not go beyond itself and grasp the world. Thought, however, does. Not only does thought go beyond itself and grasp the world, it can reflex on itself and grasp itself purely in abstraction from everything else. That's a unique mode of being which nothing else has. And it is extremely peculiar. That it requires one to really look at it intensely, because it is unlike anything else.
Yeah.
So let's continue. Just one more thing. I think it is going to come up, but the whole thing about the unity of being and thought, the same thing you said earlier, Pedro, that if something could not appear to thought, then it just wouldn't be at all. And it wouldn't be at all to the very extent that we could not even conceive it as not being. It just wouldn't be something that would ever come up, period. In any way, no matter how. Because if it appeared in any way at all, it would therefore appear to thought. If it appeared to your sensations, it would appear to thought. If it appeared in the sun, it would appear to thought. If it appeared in the quantum realm, it would appear to thought. If it appeared in your imagination, it would appear to thought. If it appeared in some transcendental mystical experience, it would appear to thought. It's impossible. Because thought is just simply that structure of determinacy, grasped explicitly as the structure of determinacy. So I don't understand the problem that they have with this.
I think one of the problems that we can call upon is that there is clearly a teleological tendency in Hegel's philosophy, right? And we know that one of the advancements of our science of nature was to eliminate the kind of explanation which calls for teleological reasons, right? Teleological causes. And I think it's very difficult to people to understand that nature actually tends to the realization of thinking beings, right? This is scandalous, but it's true, right? So I think that's one of the things, that there is this clearly preconception concerning teleological explanations, and we know that in Hegel there is a teleology, right? When we say that, for example, Dasein is the truth of Dasein in Hegelian term, right? Is the truth of becoming. When you say that the determinate being is the truth of becoming, we are making, in a sense, a teleological claim, right? Because the true of a certain teleological process is not the prius, right? The sequential prius, but that which comes next, right? As a result of a certain activity.
Yeah, and it's also the universe which generates the parts which lead back to itself. Yeah, but right, let's continue.
Of a logic is not in any sense whatsoever a being, not the absolute self-positing, not the noetic substructure of the world, not abstract objects, not the mind of the Christian God, not a substance, but in his language, according to Heidegger now, appropriating Hegel, the meaning of being, the Sinn des Seins, as Heidegger puts it in his distinctive language. The being of being reveals itself as the ground that gives itself ground and accounts for itself, a Hegelian turn of phrase in itself. The ground, the ratio by their essential origin, are the logos in the sense of the gathering of beings and letting them be. They are the hen panta. Thus science, that is metaphysics, is in truth logic. We now understand logic in the essentials, and he tells us what he thinks Hegel means by logic. We now understand the name logic in the essential sense, which includes also the title used by Hegel, and only thus explains it as the name for that kind of thinking which everywhere provides an account for the ground of beings as such, within the whole, in terms of being as ground, logos. The fundamental character is onto theologic. The divine.
Just gotta say, I don't think that characterization is true. That the logic isn't a special kind of thinking. The science of logic is, but logic as such is not. The science of logic is a special kind of thinking, only that it's the pure self-thinking of thinking. But logic is just the thinking of anything. It's all thinking whatsoever. So it's not just this specific kind of thinking, but all thinking will operate under the same ways that the logic does. Partially or incomplete, but nonetheless still the same way.
At stake in what Heidegger means by theologic, he constantly explains, is not a being. He even says, not anyone to whom we can pray or play music or dance to. He says this with a hint of contempt for traditional religion, onto theology. He means, because in Hegel, as the culmination of all metaphysical thinking, thinking is self-grounding and serves as ground for any being intelligibly what it is, then thinking is also theology in the sense that it concerns the causa sui, the absolute autonomy of thinking, self-reflection on itself, is what Heidegger means in this sense by theology. So in summation.
Now, I don't understand why this is a bad thing. I've seen, not that I've encountered too many Heideggerians, but the whole ontotheology charge being thrown around. I don't get why that's supposed to be bad.
So for Heidegger, he thinks that
I don't know.
Because we cannot think being qua being, but we can only think
there is this charge of a totalizing thought.
Is my voice coming through?
Not able to deal with difference
I can hear you.
in itself. Are you hearing?
Can you hear me, Pedro?
Hello?
Hey, Pedro,
yeah, we can hear you, Pedro, but I don't think you can hear Rain.
I think
can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, Rain. I just put your volume in the minimum. Sorry, because you had echo. Sorry.
Yeah, he fixed it. So.
Oh.
That's it. Sorry.
All good. for Heidegger, he has a concern about metaphysics and ontotheology because, for him, the way in which the intelligibility of experience works is that there's a dynamic of revealing and concealing, where it's like, insofar as I am, say, looking at an artwork and appreciating it aesthetically, it's revealed aesthetically. And insofar as I'm doing that, I actually can't have it as a thing of use, so to speak. Like you appreciate it differently than when you're like selling it or something like that. So
Yeah.
the intelligibility of whatever you're dealing with reveals, but any revealing conceals at the same time. And so for Heidegger, there's a basic openness or always available questioning, a hermeneutic questioning as to how things are being revealed and concealed in our interpretive activity. And so for him, that openness or that unclosability, so to speak, is essential to what it is to be a human or to be Dasein, as a self-questioning being, as the being whose being is an issue for it, where we can ask about our own being and so on. And by holding open the question of the meaning of being, because the meaning of being to Heidegger is different from being qua being. The meaning of being is the way that your world hangs together as a whole, kind of the hermeneutical totality, or your worlded interpretive way of living, acting, thinking, doing, questioning. So for Heidegger, the risk of metaphysics, ontotheology, and things like that are that they provide an account that is supposed to permeate and determine all beings. And therefore, that would mean that we have a account that's like locked down the being of beings, such that they could not be otherwise in some sense. And so for him, because the way we are and what it means to be a human being and the kind of relationship we have to interpretation and experience involves a fundamental openness and a questionability that instantiates ourselves as what we are, because we're fundamentally a being whose being is an issue for itself. We are questioning, self-questioning, and he thinks this is philosophy, the questionability of ourselves, our constant ability to raise the issue of ourselves and the world, etc., etc. So metaphysics to Heidegger is something that looks to close off this openness and this questionability, to put an end to questioning and therefore to thinking, in Heidegger's view. So for him, that's the darkest night. So for him, totalizing metaphysical systems, etc., are the ultimate threat. Same with things like technology, where the efficiency and fluency of using things becomes so smooth and we get so good at predicting things that it doesn't look like there's anything else to say about it other than what we've already used to account for our prediction, so to speak. So for him, this stuff fundamentally annihilates our humanity because it gets rid of our ability to question.
But you know, that affirmation has in itself a certain closure. You know, that answers forever a certain question. You know, and it's interesting that you said about this how did you say, like, when you are in front of something, you are always in this hermeneutical relationship.
You're in a hermeneutical
you interpret it in a way, but this interpretation itself will lead to a certain forgetting of other aspects of something. Would that be a fair characterization? Like, I don't need Heidegger to know that all my empirical classifications are forever open to debate. You know, that's the thing. Like, I don't think Hegelian metaphysics actually closes human beings in a metaphysical prison in which everything is answered once and for all. On the contrary, Hegelian philosophy is one of the most precise philosophies in the limit of philosophy itself. It's philosophy limiting itself. In Hegelian terms, I could say that, well, I have the capacity for analysis, or in other words, I have the capacity for abstraction. All that is presented to me in the world is fully determinate, and as such has some infinite possibilities of determinations and infinite possibilities of actually like taking some properties of it, determinacies of it, or in ignoring others, etc., 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 according to my to a certain subjective caprice. For example, I don't need Heidegger to know that each time that I look at something, I will be obliged to simplify it, to put it in the simplicity of thought and isolate some properties of it. But I also know, through Hegel, that that's never a finished and finishing activity. Our classifications will be forever open as long as our classifications are of natural things, for example. So
Yeah.
I don't think there is this risk in Hegel of closure. On the contrary, I learned with Hegel that there are some important issues, as Antonio said one of these days, there are some important issues that have no rational basis. You cannot debate, for example, the validity of a particular appropriation of the word by a will through a priori reasoning. But I know that a priori. That's the fun part, of it.
Yeah. That's exactly the thing. Yeah. So for Heidegger, this is just to elaborate a little bit more. Heidegger, some modes of thinking like ontotheology and metaphysics are especially dangerous because they conceal, they're a way of revealing that conceals the concealing dynamic itself. And so this is the forgetfulness of being, or forgetting that being qua being is questionable or open in some sense. Just to give a sense of how this stuff systematically hangs together for Heidegger. I agree with you that I don't think these are problems for Hegel. I think Hegel is ahead of hermeneutics. It's already in there. That's just the aporetic parts of, or the parts where finitude enters into the dialectic, and that comes up all the time. Finitude's essential to what's happening in Hegel, but you don't stop at finitude.
Yeah, definitely in agreement that this is not an issue for Hegel. The idea is radically open-ended. The science of logic closes with an identity that is different, or a difference in identity. The idea is radically one and radically plural, and its process is consistently the reaffirmation of both of these aspects. I actually wrote something about the availing unveiling aspect and how that is in Hegel, and I think Hegel makes an even better case than Heidegger, because for Hegel it makes total sense that there should be that, and that it's not a danger, mainly because at any given point, yes, you have a definite momentary perspectival view. At other points, you have another definite perspectival view. And at other times, you have another higher perspectival view that fully grasps these other perspectival views that you may have had at any other one time. And so your views can shift, but you're not just going from one view to another view to another view as if they don't actually have some kind of immanent connection in which these views are actually building up to something. Because for Hegel, they do build up to something. It's not just one view after another view after another view. It's not that way, and it can't be that way. And we actually don't live our life that way. We can't. Otherwise, the world just wouldn't fucking make sense. It would just be one damn thing after another. We would be like a Humean, empiricist, a Humean empiricist for whom it's just one event after another event, but I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's before me. It's just experience.
There
I'm
wouldn't
just
be
experiencing
a
the
what
moment.
to go on. There wouldn't be a what to go on. Like this, one thing that always called my attention in Kant, for example, is the idea of this pure manifold of sensibility, right? Of something which is completely preconceptual and that would be conceptually represented through imagination. There is no such a thing. There is no such a thing. I think the problem of people is that they didn't read philosophy of nature. You know what I mean? Because that's the the point in Hegelian system in which you have the most cases of Hegel admitting the limits of philosophy concerning the thinking of nature itself, and that's where he will affirm with all words that contingency is necessary to nature. And if nature is a necessary step to the idea, contingency is a necessary step to the idea itself, right? So I don't know where they're trying to go. That's my point here. I really don't get it. Maybe I don't get it, or maybe I did get it and I did surpass it, but I don't want to say that while I'm only 28 years old, you know. But I don't see the point, really.
Well,
I don't need to.
Sorry.
Yeah. Please.
The reason why these things come up with like people like Pippin and Heidegger and stuff over and over again is because they fundamentally don't know how to read Hegel, and they don't understand what it means to immanently read Hegel and what happens when you do that. A lot of these questions are addressed directly in the phenomenology, or if you know how to start the logic of science or science of logic, they can't be an issue. It's not possible to have, if you understand why the science of logic begins the way it does, you can't critique that beginning. It's uncritiquable. If you understand how like Sextus's five modes work and stuff like that, there is no objection you can raise to how Hegel starts the logic and why that's what you have to do. And if you do something else, you end up in like a five modes problem. The sort of thing that the phenomenology is supposed to knock out of your head by reading it as well. Like they presuppose epistemology and they go, oh my god, I can't get back over into the thing I was trying to get.
Yeah.
They just keep presupposing distinctions that you can't start with and are illegitimate to start with. And when you think about what happens when you try and start with them, you're just led to the beginning of the logic. Like they're just getting in their own way. They're tripping themselves up. They tie their shoelaces together when they're supposed to tie them independently or some shit.
Yeah, you're right on that, Ray. They are always presupposing the standpoint of consciousness, of the radical difference between form and content, subject and object. And that's understandable because Heidegger himself is from one of the most well-developed system of transcendental philosophy that ever existed, which is Husserl philosophy, right? In which transcendental constitution was being extended even to treat that which for Kant were like unexplainable acts of consciousness, right? So I agree with you on that. Like they are mostly going into the logic through the perspective of consciousness.
Yeah, I think one of the not so talked about but very important things that or ways you can read the phenomenology is as a diagnostic manual for spirit, where you encounter other philosophers and you can see where they're caught up in the dialectic. It's like, oh, this is what consciousness, where it thinks it has this limit that it actually doesn't, and this is the kind of limit it's presupposing. This is what the world looks like to it. And so you can diagnose thinkers by situating them in the phenomenology. And so it's like, oh, Kant, he thinks that you have categories, so to speak, his categories are kind of like psychological boxes or something like that. And you have them all, and they're just kind of independently, and then you just need to put a schema there to bring it together. It's like, this is like psychology and phrenology and the phenomenology of spirit. That element in Kant's thinking, if somebody's treating that as a limit to their capacity to know and think, that's kind of what they're thinking of. Same with other things throughout the phenomenology. It's all over the place. And many thinkers are leaping all around in that book as well. At one point they'll be here early on, at another point they'll be later. It's one of the interesting and under-discussed functions of that text.
Yeah, you guys made some very good points there. Thank you. Just to finish it up, that the fear of like getting inframed and not being able to escape that frame is not a fear in Hegelianism, nor is that a fear existentially in reality. Insofar as your conditions change and the world does change naturally, there are certain things in which like you cannot, as a rational human being, ignore without putting yourself at great peril of existence. So categories must develop. Certainly for a long time in our human history, temporally speaking, it seems that we had societies that were relatively stable, if not, one doesn't want to call them stagnant, maybe, in their cultural developments. But there is a point in which we already know that historically certain things come about, and after that, there is a necessary explosion of developments, whether we like them or not. And so our cultural frameworks just do not get the luxury of being stagnant in the end. Maybe you have a culture that, it's around for 500 years, 1,000 years, 2,000, like Egypt, and this is assuming that Egypt didn't change, which I don't think was the case. So internally there are changes already. Even if technology were stagnant, there's at least cultural developments. The thinkers, the mythologies get refined. All these other things, the ways in which what rituals become of importance, which gods, different things change. Those things change. If technologies come about, that changes the way we think. If the way we think changes, our technology tends to change as well. So the fear of existential enfrainment just doesn't seem real. Actually, we were talking about this the other day, Rain, right? Remember the whole thing about the possibility of the Matrix? And you were putting forth the idea that... and you were talking, and you brought up the point, which I think is true ultimately, that the fear of an enfrainment which we can't escape is not really possible.
No, because the frame itself contains its own incapacity to totally enframe you. Just got to think about it. It's always there. It's like having a trail. It's like your life and your experience is just a trail of breadcrumbs to the absolute. It's just sitting around there. If you're just the person who says that doesn't make sense, then you figure out how it makes sense. It's just the world just screams it at you all the time.
So and even when you have, like, say, a momentary enfrainment, like, there are developments even within that frame, so you're not stagnant. And if you reach a limit to that frame, well, then the problems will appear as problems necessarily. So at least even if you're obstinate, and you're like okay, like, this has to be right. Well, in actuality, the world that you're experiencing and the way that things are affecting you and the way that you're affecting them isn't going according to plan, then there's a real existential correction upon your mistakes. So you cannot you can never remain in that enfrainment. I see how, like, the Heideggerians want this idea of the possibility of a plurality of worldviews, which we can at any time go like, oh well, but if we think about this from the standpoint of Plato, but Spinoza said this, but Kant said that, but maybe we should go with Deleuze. Maybe that would help in this case. Maybe if we think about this like a machine. Maybe if we think about this as like an organism. Maybe if we think about this like some otherworldly spirit. All those things are different hermeneutic tools, one may say. I don't think Heidegger would like that idea of tools.
Like a master signifier, or like the thing that guides the entire interpretation.
Right. But with Hegel, you get that, except you get even better, because you get all the options that work, that do something.
Yeah. You get conscious of the possibility of considering nature purely in a mechanical manner, right? You understand that there are people who are going to make a science of nature through purely mechanical categories, right? Like, you are thematizing it. You are explicitly putting that through thought, right? But I would like to make another commentary concerning the enfrainment. And I think in this aspect specifically, Heidegger is kind of right, but not as right as a certain critique of formal reason in Hegel is, which is the enfrainment in emptied reason, right? In the idea that reason would need a certain content to be given to it from the outside, right, has far-reaching consequences and can be at least a temporary enfrainment. Think about, for example, the idea that reason is not a faculty. Let's talk of reason for a moment in terms of a faculty, right? A subjective faculty. Think about the idea that reason cannot give itself any rational content as an end. So reason is not capable of considering this or that end as intrinsically rational or any end whatsoever. So reason here becomes only an instrument of a certain interesting monkey called human beings for ends which themselves cannot be considered rational or irrational. The reduction of reason to instrumentality is a very dangerous enfrainment, which we are living through today, right? The idea that reason is only about efficacy to ends which themselves cannot be accounted for in any rational manner is a certain enfrainment which is dominating the world right now. And in his critique of technology, I think there is the hint of this of this this idea that we could reduce everything to mere tools of purely individual ends which cannot be accounted for in any rational manner whatsoever. So we could be so addicted to the means that we wouldn't think anymore about the content of our ends, right?
Yes, and I totally agree with that. And I think Ray and I came to the agreement that we agree that momentarily the enfrainment is definitely possible, and moments in history may be very long or very short, so comparatively, but it is still a moment. So the enfrainment cannot be an absolute enfrainment, but that there is long stretches towards which it may hold, certainly. I mean, just look at our current historical moment. Generally, as a global societies, and all those caught up in that, which is everybody, we are all enframed within the logic of capitalism, where like people literally cannot think of a world that doesn't function under this, this objective thing that they believe is called the market. Oh, we can't do it because of the market. We can't do this because of the market. Can't do that because of the market. No, the market won't allow it. Whether it's real or not. Most of the case, it's not. But there is a real enfrainment. That's the only, there's no other alternative. That's one kind of enfrainment that we suffer. So it's not just a technological enfrainment. It's just it's what probably it's what Marx would call ideology. That's another kind of enfrainment in which we get caught up in. Eventually, it has to fall away because the reality catches up, and and it hits consciousness in the face. But it takes a while.
I think you could argue that non-Hegelian philosophers are a series of people articulating different forms of being enframed, where they hit the limit in different kinds of ways.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. And they're like, well, why doesn't Hegelianism fall into it? Because it's the it's the theory of the enfrainment of self-enfrainment.
Yeah, that's the interesting part. It's actually meta philosophy, right? We can't even call it philosophy It's metaphilosophy. When you see someone trying to reduce everything to mechanism, you already know that mechanism itself will fall apart in its own account. You don't need to mess with them. Like, one thing I learned is that let people do their shit. They will be uh, betrayed by their own commitments because their own commitments are contradictory in the end, right? Just take a look
Yeah.
at the mechanical explanation, which cannot explain shit, right? Uh, the whole thing about mechanics is that it can explain these interesting qualitative phenomenons, right? But you can you can always go further in the level of mechanical division to infinity. So in the end, you can explain shit with mechanics, right? Just an example of it.
Yeah, I think
Yep.
and that's one thing with the Hegelian sense of history. Um, it's knowing how reason works, and so knowing the limits of any kind of thing someone says to you or things people do. It's because you know the development of spirit, so to speak. You know how reason works, and so you know how something has limited itself, so to speak. Someone has limited themselves. And so if you have a comprehensive diagnostic knowledge of this, you know how history works in some sense. It's not necessarily predictive, but it allows you, again, diagnostic.
Just another small comment here, like just so the people out there know, like you don't get out of an enframent only by thinking. Thinking is part of it, but you are actually a being in nature which has some mechanical aspects to yourself, which means you have certain habits would tend to repeat. So it's not only a matter of sitting down and, well, I will disenframe it through pure logic. That's not what we are arguing here, right? Like, understanding that your standpoint is limited is only the beginning, because then you have to work on yourself to get out of it, because your standpoint will produce habits through time, and these habits will not disappear when you change your intellectual standpoint, right, guys? Like, no one
Yep.
becomes like a fucking completely self-determinate being by only understanding the logic. No, you have actually to do some work on yourself. That's how things work, right?
Yeah,
Just
definitely.
like a side comment here.
Yeah, there's
So
objective factors
that
to this.
Marxists don't think that we are saying that we can like transform our personalities and personal limitations only through thinking, but that's the essential condition to it. Because if you don't know how your standpoint is limited, you won't be able to address the habits that sprung from that standpoint.
Yeah, good points. Let's move on. Before we move on, if anybody has seen Dune, seems like Pippin might be a fan. Might be a Fremen. Seems like he had some spice before this talk.
I didn't watch it. I watched it only the beginning, but I didn't finish.
People who take spice in Dune, after a while, they get that glowing blue eyes.
Oh,
I thought you were trying to say he's on crack or something.
Hey, guys, come on! This is going public. Don't say that Pippin is on crack.
No, AW has never implied that what's his name? Robert Pippin smokes crack. He has never said that or implied that at any point or time.
Okay, thank you, Josh.
And for the record, to our knowledge, he does not smoke crack or any other illicit drug.
Allegedly. Okay,
not.
let's continue.
It's a good one.
Metaphysics responds to being as logic, and is accordingly in its basic characteristics everywhere logic, but a logic that thinks the being of beings, and thus logic which is determined by what differs in the difference, ontoteleology. Heidegger means that metaphysics is determined by this difference between the original availability of the meaningfulness of being and the beings, without being able to think this difference, and must remain unthought in metaphysical thinking. Compare what Heidegger is saying to what Hegel says, and the general accuracy of his characterization will, I think, be clear. Here's Hegel from the Encyclopedia of Logic. The logical is to be thought in a system of thought determinations in which the antithesis between subjective and objective in its usual meaning disappears. The meaning of thinking and its determinations is more precisely expressed by the ancients when they said that nous governs the world, or by our own saying that there is reason in the world, by which we mean that reason is the soul of the world, inhabits it, and is immanent in it as its almost innermost nature. It's universal. But of course, Heidegger has a problem with that version of metaphysical thinking. He notes approvingly that Hegel's approach is developmental, not deductive, and that this developing thought, thinking is intertwined with the history of thought, with the history of philosophy. In his engagement with this thinking, Heidegger tries to think rightly what really has been thought in the developing positions. Hegel's attempt is an Aufhebung, a preserving and raising up of all that has been rightly but only partly and insufficiently thought into a whole. Heidegger accepts this intertwining with the history of thought, but he says his approach is to think what is unthought, remains hidden in the history of thinking as logos. Accordingly, his engagement is not an elevation, not a progression, but as he says, a step back, a Schritt zurück. While Hegel thinks the ultimate identity of thinking and being, Heidegger's basic thought is difference. Thinking's determination of absolute intelligibility actually.
Well, again, now, that ultimate identity is also the ultimate difference. There's no way around it. It is how it functions. Hegel does put the emphasis on the unity, mainly because at the time the problem was people complained that there could be no unity. So, the emphasis on unity is there because of that. But he makes it very clear in so many places that the identity and the difference are equal. Like it's not one over the other. Except the identity and the difference is between one and the same thing in the end. That which is different as being different is identical. Is different as being different to its own difference, which means it's also identical. And that which is identical is also identical through being different. The identity between being and thought is a superfluous thing because being is thought. Right from the logic, there is no distinction made, so Hegel has no problem in overcoming that supposed issue. And if by being what Heidegger means, and which is what most people seem to want to mean, I don't understand why. Well, I do understand why. I just think it's a confused thing, and it gets confused by using the language of being when what they mean is nature.
Yeah. There is this confusion. A lot.
And in which case, Hegel still has no problem. Because in nature, we still find the logos. And insofar as we don't find the logos, we don't find anything intelligible in nature at all. Because what intelligible is precisely that which is determinate and appears in the first place. And if it doesn't appear, then it's not relating to us, has nothing to do with our world, isn't a thing in the world, isn't a thing outside the world, isn't a thing anywhere. It's nothing. So, who cares? All right, continuing.
Seeds before the true subject matter of thought, the meaning of being. Something remains unasked, the difference between the meaningfulness of being originally and the beings that depend on this manifestability. As Heidegger puts the point, for Hegel, the matter of thinking is being with respect to having been thought in absolute thinking and as absolute thinking. For us, the matter of thinking is the same and thus being, but being with respect to its difference from beings. Put more precisely, for Hegel, the matter of thinking is the idea as the absolute concept. For us, formulated in a preliminary fashion, the matter of thinking is the difference as difference. I mean, one way to put this.
Again, this strikes me as just a complete misunderstanding of what Hegel's doing on Heidegger's part. You know, the difference between being and beings. Well, Hegel doesn't even have to ask the question. He shows it. He shows, okay, even if you have being, simpliciter, you know, being as such, not a being, but just the being, it's indeterminate. Well, how are you going to get to beings? Now, I don't think Heidegger ever actually explains how being gets to beings. There's all this talk about unveiling, openness, but he has no way of explaining how the being of beings, you know. Whereas Hegel actually has a good explanation for it. It's the idea. The whole process idea is that which as beings, it's beings as beings. Fully intelligibly. It makes perfect sense. And it works, and it happens exactly that way. It's not just Hegel making this up.
Right. For Heidegger, that gap is essential to even having his entire account. If that gap was gone, he wouldn't, at least in his mind, he wouldn't be able to produce his account of finite philosophy. So he doesn't have it, and that's the point for him.
But take this idea, like for us, formulated in a preliminary fashion, the matter of thinking is the difference as difference. Okay, but what is difference? And can difference be thought without the thinking of identity? Or at least the identity of difference itself? You know what I mean? Like, that's my problem. They are employing categories of thought to try to think the out of thought. You know, like when you bring up difference as difference, I don't know if you are simply like with a understanding fixation on difference without seeing that difference by itself cannot account for itself.
It's just the understanding. They don't know what's happening in the logic. They don't know how to read it. They don't see how the concepts are working. They don't even know how to situate it because they start with this epistemological sense for what the project is. So, like, it's just the understanding shredding itself, trying to critique Hegel.
Yeah, because there is always this, like this prevailing of finitude over infinity, this prevailing of difference over identity, right? Or to think identity without negativity, to think identity in its absolute affirmation without any reference to identity. But they never provide a proper concept of difference itself. They never provide any determination that could differentiate difference from identity itself. You know, like that's where I don't get it. Why they're being so, how can I say, dumb, really? Like the whole thing about the logic is to give an account not only of a certain arbitrarily chosen content, but also of deducting this content in a certain developmental thinking of thinking, right? And I cannot see it but as a fixation of the understanding. Okay, now I'm going to think difference. No, but and then there is identity, and identity is explained away with difference. It's the same thing with finitude and infinity. Finitude, if you think infinity, you will eventually, if you think it like completely separated in its separateness from finitude, you will explain away finitude. Finitude will appear to you as something untrue. If you think difference in its completely fixated meaning, the meaning that understanding gives to it, you will explain away identity as an illusion. There is always this this tendency to explain away things, right? Like the opposite of that dichotomy is always something which is clearly limiting your explanation, but it cannot be accounted for within your explanation, but then you try to, in a reductive kind of way, to explain it away out of your system of thought.
Mm-hmm. Let's continue.
The identity with being, of being with the concept, the absolute, is not a moment in the logic. It can't be. Or there would be another moment about its possible intelligibility. But more on this to come.
Wait, hold on. Let me go back a couple seconds.
It's possible intelligence of this section. If Heidegger has rightly characterized the general nature of absolute is not a moment in the logic. Hegel, the matter of thinking is the idea as the absolute concept. For us, formulated in a preliminary fashion, the matter of thinking is the difference as difference. I mean, one way to put this is the identity with being with the concept, the absolute, is not a moment in the logic. It can't be. But there would be another moment about its possibility.
All right, and honest. This is not even just a Hegelian point, right? This would just be the classical skepticism point, which is, where do you get this assumption that being and thought are different? It's unjustified. It's an assumption of thought, which is what the phenomenology answers. So it's a bullshit argument.
Intelligible. But more on this to come. So, in conclusion of this section, if Heidegger has rightly characterized the general nature of Hegel's project in the logic, and I think he has, what is it in the logic as metaphysics that remains, as he keeps saying, unasked, unthought? As we just noted, the answer is supposed to be the absolute difference between being and beings, a way of constantly confusing the question, what it means to be at all with what it means to be this or that being. This is, of course, Heidegger's master thought throughout his career. The contrasting question is, how is such being, or beings in the light of the meaning of being, like living beings, to be manifest, available to us, if not through and as thought? Of course, there certainly are determinate beings, and there is no initial reason to think that pure thinking cannot determine what is necessary for any being to count as an intelligible being, metaphysica generalis, nor that pure thinking cannot account for what make possible kinds of beings being what they are, metaphysica specialis. But if in such enterprises what Dan Dahlstrom has called, in Heidegger's name, the logical prejudice prevails, the claim that the meaning of being itself, the very availability, manifestability of being as such, can only be logos, what logos requires, then according to Heidegger, everything will have been distorted, including such metaphysica specialis regions as living being. In sum, Heidegger's question, the meaning of being, is not a question about ontological commitment, what kinds of beings there are. Telling us there are bears in the woods does not tell us what it means to us that there are bears. What it means for there to be anything, for Heidegger, is a question of their availability to Dasein, their being manifest, that they show up for Dasein, as he puts it, in their significance, meaningfulness, Bedeutsamkeit. So the issue here for Heidegger is what he keeps calling primordiality. He obviously thinks beings can be known to be what they are, but the original manifestability of meaningful being in general is their significance, and that is not an object of knowledge, only secondarily, not the primordial availability of being. Accordingly, any question about meaning.
Okay, well, put in that frame, it still makes no sense to attack Hegel's system on that basis, because all that Heidegger is saying, okay, well, the question is not about, like, just give me the set of the ontological entities that might be there, what he would call the ontic, the beings, the set of beings or whatever. The question is, what does it mean for there to be anything in relationship of the world, which would obviously be the life system in which I exist, my own self-understanding. And I suppose that the issue here is that Pippin and Heidegger seem to take self-understanding to only be possible conceptually, and that determinacies and intelligibility are only in a purely self-conceptual, like, explicit way, which I don't think is the case for Hegel. Quite rightly, the way I interpret Hegel is that, yes, for the concept, when we are operating and fully conscious and explicitly explicating things, they will have the form, of course, of the concept as such. But when we're not aware of that, nonetheless, those structures are still there. I don't have to have a concept of colors to see colors. Nonetheless, there is the real determinacy and relationship of colors in the system of vision. Nonetheless, there is a system and determinacies of emotions in the human psychology. I don't have to be conceptually aware of these things, but these things being present at all are to my consciousness, going to be a real existential determinacy, which gives some manner of intelligibility to my world, insofar as I am a conscious being at all. Even animals have to have some measure of active intelligibility in the world. The animal feels hunger. This is an existential relationship. They don't have to think, oh, I'm hungry. I don't get hungry, and I don't have to go and think, oh, I'm hungry. I need to make the judgment that I need to go eat. I feel hungry, I go eat. The animal feels hungry, they go eat. This, nonetheless, is a determinate reality. It's a logic, it's a logos. And it's not a logos from fucking nowhere. It's a logos exactly in relationship to the web of the contextual existence of that being, which is entirely immanent to the existence of that being. The whole ecosystem is intertwined with the being of perhaps not any individual animal, but certainly to the general species and the general populations of fauna and flora. And the meteorological process of of the weather and pattern and climate. So I still don't see what the problem is that is so dire here, because it seems everything they want, Hegel has. You guys got anything to add on that?
Nope.
Neither.
All right.
Meaning can bear only on a being open to the question of meaning, and in much of Heidegger's career, this meant a phenomenological approach, what such meaningfulness amounts to, or what it is like for Dasein. At this level of summary, we can gloss this as shows up as familiar, with some degree of significance, and if unfamiliar, in a way that invites integration back into the familiar. And he makes very clear in texts like Kant's thesis about being, the tradition has taken this meaningful availability to be at bottom possible assertability, even speculative assertability. In that text, being, according to Kant, is understood as positing, Setzung, positio. And what he means is that for something to be available is for it to be fit to be an object of a discursive judgment. That is the logical prejudice noted before. Being means is available as discursive, even speculatively discursive intelligibility. And as noted, this, for Heidegger, leaves unexamined the conditions under which anything could show up for Dasein at all as originally or primordially meaningful. Since Heidegger does not mean recognizable in a concept, he defends a much more radical and unprecedented claim that such availability is preconceptual, a non-discursive mode of availability. In Being and Time, as many of you know, this is explained by the notion of being in the world, a distinctive mode of intentionality oriented from Dasein's practical tasks. All in an interconnected network beings can be said to be primordially available, first of all, as pragmata, things of use in Dasein's task, all in an interconnected network of tools, practices, and hierarchies of importance, a world. We are onto such significances not by being able to make claims, but by what Heidegger calls attunement, Stimmung. It is the worldhood of the world, worldliness itself, that thus makes possible the availability of any of the being. Anything shows up for Dasein by virtue of its place in such a world of assignments and tasks, and so can count as the meaning worldliness of the world, so can count as the meaning of being itself. That is the context in which the question of life, what it means for things to be available, to show up as living, is to be understood. This is all quite breathless, but I believe it's relatively uncontroversial as a crude summary of Heidegger, and it's enough for us to pursue our question. As we have begun to see, the background of one of Heidegger's clearest discussions of organic life in chapters 2, 3, and 4 of his 1929-1930 lecture series, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, is quite sweeping. The basis of Hegel's claim for his logical idealism, or the identity of thinking and being, is that thinking's self-constitution, autotelic self-constitution of the requirements for any determinacy, must already just count thereby as the only possible meaning of any being being the being it is, its delimitability from other beings. This is supposed to be shown in the logic, beginning with its opening claim that the mere thinking of being is not a coherent thought at all. The indeterminacy of mere being, its indistinguishability from what is not being, makes it indistinguishable from nothing. Therewith,
that's just straight up false. I consider this shameful. This guy's considered a renowned scholar of Hegel. The way being and nothing become identical has nothing to do with the comparison of, this is being's indeterminate and nothing's indeterminate. They both lack content. That's why they're the same. I know Hegel says that as one of the ways to give people an in. That's actually not what it is. And he tells you also that's not really what it is. Like literally in the paragraph Becoming, it's like what it is not that external comparison of both of them being indeterminate. What it is the fact that in thinking immediately, in thinking the unrelated, or the absolutely abstractly universal, if you want to put it in that other category, there's nothing to think. And it's not in like, there is an object called nothing to think. No, it's like thinking itself is just going to be just as immediate its own immediate object, which is, the moment it is, it's gone. It doesn't appear. It fails to appear. The immediate appearance is also immediately vanished. In trying to think immediately, you can't think at all. And what is present is the absence of thinking. But that's just as immediate as a thought that which, was just immediately is. Yeah.
This follows the spontaneous self-constitution by pure thinking of what would satisfy the determinacy conditions without which nothing could be a determinate anything. We've already seen that Heidegger will object that this excludes.
That whole language of satisfying the determinacy conditions is that's definitely a Kantian thing. It's the whole like, it's a Kantian view of what's happening in the science of logic, in which what's really happening is we're going into we're deducing the conditions for the possibility of determinacy. Well, being, if it is just immediate, then it can't be determinate, but clearly, we seem to think it is. So, what would it be the at least minimal condition for the possibility of its determinacy for it to start being determined in any way? And that's how we get into, becoming. That's how we get into determinate being. That's how we get into determinacy and quality and all that jazz. Which is wrong. That's not the way Hegel's going about it in any ways.
A very design whose mode of being is not determinable this way. But Heidegger's most sweeping objection is that Hegel has exaggerated the capacity of pure thinking to spontaneously determine itself. That's the causa sui bit we mentioned before, dogmatically insisting that it is an infinite capacity by being absolutely self-determining and self-authorizing, whereas, most famously, he wants to show human thinking is only finite, possible by virtue of contingencies and dependencies that cannot be construed as moments of thinking's self-constitution and cannot be understood empirically or psychologically. Thinking, primarily judging or discursivity, thinking's activity of distinguishing and synthesizing and inferring, must depend especially on some moment of prior disclosure of any being's being as it is. This or that, such and such or not, a moment prior to discursive claim making that this is so. It's a famous aletheia, uncovering notion of truth.
Well, he's just wrong there. Trivially wrong. If you can do being to nothing, Heidegger's wrong. You can't do being to nothing, therefore Heidegger's wrong. There's no spatial temporality there. It's not a spatial, like what reveals that being is nothing is not a spatial determination. It's not a temporal determination.
And there's also this appeal to the fact that we are conditioned beings, and by that fact we wouldn't be able to think autonomously, which is clearly, this is dealt with in the science of logic, right?
Yeah.
You need to be something, and to be something is to be limited. To be determinate is to have something which you refer to as outside of you. You know, like there's no such a thing as even God is self-differentiating. Even God has limits. You know, I don't see the point here. This seems to be reductionist thinking at its best.
Yeah, it's just it's literally presumptuous. It presumes,
the
pre-assumes.
Thing is, it's the old confusion between enabling conditions and determining conditions. They cannot think conditions which leave space for determinacy, which is not a consequence of the condition itself. And they cannot account for it because they are not doing logic.
Mm-hmm.
2. Hegel on the fundamentality of logic. It's not difficult to establish in general terms that Heidegger has captured something about the fundamentality of logic, or pure thinking in Hegel. Hegel doesn't insist that the question of being necessarily always amounts to a question about what it is to possibly be this or that being. That's the result of the first moment of the being logic, and that is the moment where the deepest confrontation, Auseinandersetzung, with Heidegger must take place. In this, as in so much else, Hegel, at least at this point, follows Aristotle. Being is said in many ways, but there is some primacy to being as a totity, a determinate being. I noted that this does not mean that it is the job of the logic to determine what it is to be any particular determinate being, but to determine what anything at all must be in order to be able to determine what any determinate being is. But this last formulation does not seem to reach the question Heidegger is interested in, since it is still always directed to the beings, the Seiende. As Heidegger realizes, the closest formulation in Hegel for the meaning of beings is simply pure thinking. That's its meaning. That's its availability, determinability as such. But that topic, which Heidegger wants to treat as being's own manifestation, its unconcealing or happening or rightness, and so what any pure thinking as judging must presuppose, is not a topic for pure thinking. Although we've reached the point where a very great deal would have to be said about Heidegger's
I don't think that characterization is right. That if we frame this in the way that, like with Heidegger's question, what is the meaning of being? I don't think it's logic. I think it's the whole system. In which logic is obviously the final self-thematization of the entire system, including itself as the thematization of the whole system. But it includes everything. It includes natural being, it includes biological, well, it includes psychological being, it includes social being, it includes cultural being, and then it includes the thinking of that being of itself, and finally the thinking of its own thinking.
Usual language. It's here that we do seem to reach some sort of absence in Hegel's enterprise, even if it's a separate question whether that means that something crucial is missing or not. That's an important distinction. Something could be missing in Hegel, and it could be also insignificant, not a part of a crucial critique. We'll come back to that at the end. If the meaning of the being of beings, the absolute, is knowability, have we asked in the logic what it is, what it means to us to be knowable? Thinkability, understood as a logic does, as in principle knowability, as such, is not one of the determinate moments of the logic, as we've seen. And when it is, in some sense, judgments, characteristics become, judgments, characteristics become self-conscious in the concept logic as the forms of judging this or that in their determinate possible inferential relations. That's what's attended to. For Hegel, we cannot provide an independent theory of the thinkable as such. We manifest thinking by pure thinking. We know what pure thinking is by thinking, directed at itself. Any other formulation would presuppose and so elude itself. But this means that the science of pure thinking does not and cannot count the availability of pure thinking itself as one of its moments. And from Heidegger's point of view, this is not adequate. What we learn in
What the fuck's he talking about? Of course it accounts for its own thinkability. It accounts for its own thinkability in the absolute idea, which is literally also what Hegel calls absolute cognition. And it also accounts for its own thinkability as a process of real worldliness. It accounts for nature, it accounts for the arising of living beings in nature, it accounts for the rising of conscious beings in nature, feeling beings, social beings, cultural beings, and finally, and these beings are all throughout this entire thing, also thinking beings, once we get to the social being part. And then it accounts for the ways in which those thinking beings became aware of thinking itself. It's just false.
The process of trying to think anything at all determinately is the possible determinacy of any being. Thinking is the enacting of thinking. And the reflective self-consciousness at the end of the logic, the concept of intelligibility itself, is a form of self-consciousness about the intelligibility of any being, not something like a reflection on being as intelligibility itself. That's always unasked, unthought, presupposed, even if manifested or enacted, and that throughout the entire Western tradition, including up till today. The concept logic is supposed to allow the inclusion of the logic inside itself, inside the concept, but that just covers what we have been through in the book, a circular repetition as we get to the end of the logic. What the thinking of any being systematically amounts to. It does not and cannot include what Heidegger seems to be asking, what it means for Dasein, for being to be thinking self-determination of thinking. Now, if you think it's an intriguing but as yet still unclear question, I'm afraid that doesn't get all that much clearer throughout Heidegger's career, but there's something I find intriguingly powerful about this characterization through Hegel as the culmination of all Western, what we've learned to call, and I hate the term, logocentrism. I should not digress. The question that both must be and cannot be inside the concept is that question. Put another way, logic itself, or the question, what is logic? What is the meaning of logic? Is not a possible moment. Role of the phenomenology here also crucial, but we can leave that aside for the moment. As we know from Heidegger's 1928 lecture course, now published as the fundamental metaphysical foundations of logic, Heidegger thinks that question is deeply intertwined with
Okay. What is logic? The science of logic. It seems that that's just an assumption that that from the standpoint of logic, we ought to take then a finite standpoint of consciousness in which, okay, what being that it is what it is, what it is, that it is what it is. What is the meaning of logic for me? Well, the meaning of logic for me, once I have determined what the valid and total nature of the categories of thought are in the self-determination of thought, which is also self-determination of determination, then I can just go and cognize anything. That's the meaning of it.
But I think there's a interesting point here. Like, what he's saying, that logic cannot ask for itself within itself, right? But what I think he is implying here, I think the basic mistake here is the implication that logic works as a ground, to everything else that comes by, and that they forget that actually Hegel's philosophy is a circle. So maybe yes, logic cannot be accounted for within itself, but it can be accounted for as the end of the phenomenology of spirit. I don't know if that would be a proper answer to it.
Well, yes. If the question is about my finite relationship as Dasein to this domain, of cognition we call logic, then the question is already a determinate, what Hegel called a real philosophy question. It's not merely a metaphysical question, it's already an existential question. But then that existential question is answered by the fact that now that I know what reason is, by reasoning, I can reason everything. And therefore now my world starts being reasonable, because I can now see the reason in everything, and I can start bundling things up in a whole system of meaning. I can do hermeneutics, except well, instead of just haphazardly.
Also worth noting. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Logic can't. The idea. Logic can't ask the question of itself. It doesn't even start with itself.
Yeah.
The question of what logic might be is something that or what logic is something that just comes about from the way it begins. It doesn't set up logic as this thing that I'm going to ask about. It's just moving from indeterminacy and seeing what happens. It's like being an empiricist about logic. But you actually end up just performing the entire act yourself. There's not they just didn't know how to start the book. They didn't know how to read it from the very beginning. They didn't understand the introduction. They didn't understand the preface. They didn't understand the first moves. They just didn't see why that happened.
Not only that, the thing you pointed out, by the way, let me just say this. The question about what is logic is a question of determinacy about the entire domain of logic itself, which is only possible once you have logic external to itself.
That's the point. Like, what I'm saying here, and I think it's a good point, is that I think this is that those old problems, like concerning the immediacy or mediated character of the beginning logic, right? Because if we think, for example, about a geometrical system, right, with any axiom whatsoever, take, for example, line and a point and space, etc., etc. Line, point, and space cannot be accounted for within a system which presupposes it. But we should not, as Hegelians, which pass through the problem, to think that the beginning logic is only immediate. No, there is mediation to it. there is the whole phenomenology of spirit showing that, like having at its crowning moment the destruction of the division between consciousness, certainty, and truth, and form and content, and the beginning of the thinking of thinking. So maybe you cannot account for logic within logic itself, but philosophy is not a straight line; it is a circle. And if you continue through logic and passing through nature and then spirit, you will get to the point of the derivation of the necessity of the beginning of logic itself, out of logic, right? Because in phenomenology, we are doing logic, but not explicitly. We are simply dealing with certain configurations of consciousness, right? So, okay, what I think it's going on here, like they are taking logic as a ground, not as a moment in the circularity of the system. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, you're 100% right. That's it. That they think that it's some absolute beginning. It's not.
You can account for logic if you think through phenomenology. You can see how the commitments of consciousness will lead to the destruction of the basic divisions of consciousness itself. So logic, the beginning of logic itself, can be understood as immediate and mediated. If you understand then immediately, which is my favorite, actually, like I think I'm with Rain on that, like thinking indeterminacy or trying to account for determinateness itself before thinking other stuff, for me, is the proper way of beginning how to do philosophy, right? But philosophy is a circle. So the beginning itself of logic can be understood as mediated through the whole parade of failures in the phenomenology, right?
Yep. Which is, you could also mediate it through the entire history of philosophy and also the or general history, the development of history.
Or you can begin by nature. You can begin by subjective spirit. You can begin, like you can begin by many places. You can begin for whatever place you begin. But if you start to think the concepts which are imminent to the problems that you're going to find, that will lead to a dialectical development, immanent, self-determining dialectical development that will eventually lead to the thinking of the pure categories of thought themselves. So, yeah, logic may not be able to account for itself, but Hegel is not only logic. Hegel is nature. Hegel is spirit too.
Yep. And it's only in that the context of that system, logic, nature, spirit, that logic appears as logic. Before that, the domain of logic as logic quite literally does not exist. Because in order to exist, it would have to have a relationship to otherness. But since it is just immediately itself as a closed system of thought, that's all it is. It's just a closed system of the self-determinations of the concept or the idea. But this is not yet determined as, this is a domain of logic, as opposed to a domain of nature. It's not until we get the distinctions of the domains that then logic appears, and therefore requires, and also explains then also its very being as logical domain.
The meaning of being question. So Heidegger is right that his question remains unasked, even unthought. So section 3, Hegel on life. Hegel is fully aware of the skepticism of his proposal that life is a pure or logical concept will encounter. The idea of life has to do with the subject matter so concrete and, if you will, so real that in dealing with it, one may seem, according to the common notions of logic, to have overstepped its boundaries. Nevertheless, a consequence of this exploration of logical form alone, through this exploration of logical form alone, we're supposed to know that there must be distinct forms of thought specific to the intelligibility of self-organizing beings, of perceiving and desiring self-organizing beings, and of self-conscious and rational, perceiving and desiring self-organizing beings, or specific to plants, animals, and human animals. We know what it is to be a living being in a way that cannot depend on discovering this empirically. So how do we know it? This generates a task that's more ambitious than simply delimiting the features of that special logical form required for the intelligibility of living beings or actions or human practices. This demarcation is of crucial importance to Hegel, but he also wants to treat the question in a way that responds to the question Kant raised in the third critique. Granted, we can make this logical difference, but what is its status? Does the teleological form designate a realm of being only explicable by appeal to such a form? Hegel, of course, answers yes to that question, in contrast to Kant. He claims that such distinctive conceptual forms have a necessity that descends from his general inquiry into the intelligibility of objects at all. The argument is that objects and events would not be available to us in their intelligibility if the distinction between living and non-living beings could not be made. This means that accounts given of non-living beings would be insufficient on their own terms to account for the distinction between living and non-living. Now, qualification is necessary at this point so that we're not misunderstood. Just as Kant didn't attempt to deduce the necessary existence of causal relations, but sought to show that any event that did exist must stand in a necessary relation to some prior event. And just as Kant did not try to deduce the necessary existence of living beings, but tried to show that any world that required mechanistic explanations of what exists, or any world in which change is a matter of efficient causation, must also cannot rule out that there are changes like gestation, birth, growth, reproduction, disease, and death, which cannot be properly accounted for by the logical form appropriate for non-living beings. So Hegel is not out to deduce the necessary existence of living beings, has an ambition similar to Kant's. That is, such changes cannot be properly accounted for by the logical form appropriate for non-living beings. But it's also much more ambitious because he denies that teleological explanations are merely subjectively necessary. Hegel's defense of his position begins with reason's requirements on explanation as mechanism, the form according to which relations among objects are established. But, quote, the diverse parts behave indifferently to each other, and their linkage is only external to them, unquote, moving matter in motion. What he tries to show is that mechanism as a principle, as a pure or logical principle, rather than any first-order empirical discovery about the world, already amounts to, implicitly, what is most distinctive about teleology, an explanation by a concept, how a thing matches up to its concept, although in mechanism, the concept is only, he says, in itself, not for itself. That is, mechanism presupposes its appropriateness and the demarcation of the domain of its appropriateness, and this is a normative suitability that will become more explicit, more for itself as the limitations of mechanism and the restrictions on this domain are thought through. Mechanism is as much a pure concept as life, and the Denkbestimmung, thought determination, that nature is explicable mechanistically, is an a priori claim on the same standing as the demarcation of organic nature and teleology. This form or concept, he shows, cannot cover relations which are not externally or accidentally contingent, but ordered according to the nature of the elements, where objects are essentially differentiated, so that the objects, quote, are what they are only in their relation to each other. That is, his claim is that while mechanism posits a radical independence among moving objects in motion, the results of mechanism itself reveal a regular dependence, fixed and unvarying, among such putative independent objects. And to account for this, must transform itself into a position that can do this justice, not just treat it, say, reproduction by species form, as some endlessly astonishing repeating accidents, an infinite chain of efficient causation, which is no explanation at all. This happens and that happens and this happens and that happens.
Yep.
He tries to connect this form and its transition to syllogistic form. But here and throughout, that seems more a gloss on this underlying argument about independence and dependence relations among explicanda. He calls this transformation of mechanism into something in which its concept of itself is more, but still not fully explicit or for itself, chemism. And he's thinking of chemical compounds. But there are also explicable relations that are both external and mechanical, but uniquely suited by their natures for other elements, like the gears of a watch. He wants to say that a consideration of the two forms and their logical properties, mechanism and chemism, on their own can generate this joint possibility. That is, the idea of elements both external to one another and yet not indifferent to each other. And that is one wherein the role of the concept of the thing is more explicit and more implicitly invoked in explanation, because it is a watch and should keep accurate time in explaining a gear. In his terms, the simple immediacy of the elements has been denied, and they are now, all the elements, to be understood as what they actually are, only in relation to each other and the whole, the artifact's concept. He then tries to show how such an external relation of concept to explanation, by reference to a maker, already contrasts with a being whose ends are internal to itself by nature, not by an external source. And this initially defines for him a living being. He ultimately wants to show that the connection between such living beings and beings which can be, beings which can set and pursue ends, or animal life. Now, all of these transitions are supposed to be internal to the conceptual moment under interrogation, so Hegel has a different and stronger notion of the necessity of what reason requires of itself than Kant. But we have enough in view, I hope, to make a final comparison and contrast with Heidegger. So section 4, Heidegger on life. With all this in place, it's easy to see that it's impossible simply to compare Hegel and Heidegger on the concept of life, its content, and objectivity. Even that way of putting the matter ignores the radicality of Heidegger's approach. It's an
Just one thing to say. I thought he probably, well, I'm not surprised he didn't bring it up. Don't know why I thought he would. Part of the justification, if not probably what to me is the strongest justification for why is life an a priori category in the fucking first place? Because thought is alive. Duh. When you look at the way that it has developed the entire way, it's just like a living thing. Just like one. It reproduces itself. It grows. It reabsorbs itself. Yeah.
I think in this case, I would like the most determinate being will have in itself all the determinations pertaining to the less determinate beings. And thought is the most determinate being. So in that sense, it doesn't need to go out of itself to find out all determinations. If it wasn't the most determinate being, it wouldn't be able to take within it, in its simplicity, any content whatsoever, including the concept of life, the content of a living being. But I don't know, I am really, like, I will confess you that I'm kind of lost right now in the discussion here, because I'm really not being able to follow truly the thread, because most of the assumptions that are driving his speech are false assumptions. For example, he just said a while that logic cannot account for itself. That's the basic problem that Hegel was dealing with in his second introduction with what must the science of logic begin, and it's pretty answered to me. I think he's right in pointing out that logic cannot account for itself, but the science of logic, it's not a grounding, an absolute grounding to all that comes. Like, we are dealing with a circular system. Reason is circular in itself. So I don't know. So like from that on, I don't know what I'm watching here. You know what I mean? I don't know if you share my feelings here.
Usually when a thinker starts bad, what you get is kind of a train wreck that keeps piling up as it goes forward.
Yeah.
That's the reason why I'm pretty restricted in my philosophy readings, because Hegel doesn't do that. A lot of other thinkers do that, and it's just like, I'm getting nowhere. I'm not learning anything, because this is an attempt to make sense or carry something to its end, which is just fundamentally a mistake. And the mistake will repeat at different points and stack and grow out, and it gets complexly wrong.
Yeah,
Because of
complexly
simple
wrong.
early mistakes. It can actually be harder to read a bad philosopher than
Yeah,
a good one
yeah,
because of that.
exactly. Yeah,
Like,
exactly, Wayne. Like you just articulated a feeling that I had that I couldn't articulate. Like complexly bad, like
yeah,
It reminds me of I think the author's Paul Wolfendale. It's called, I think it's like The Emperor's New Clothes, like a critique of object-oriented ontology. And like in the introduction, he, like, the book is about 200 pages. He writes about how like he mainly focuses on just one guy, not the general people of object-oriented ontology, because he's mainly interested in the guy who originated, which is Graham Harman. And he says, like, everybody knows when you encounter this that this is bullshit, but it's complex bullshit. So to point out just what is actually wrong is a monumental task of digging through all these assumptions to figure out what really ultimately is the simple problem behind it all.
Yeah. Like, and this has all to do with the externality of one idea to another, right? So think about it. What is easier to commit to memory, like the sequence of natural numbers, or like a collection of random objects, which doesn't seem to have any connection whatsoever to each other? That's the same feeling. Like when the elements of a certain complexity doesn't seem to have a proper immanent connection to each other, it is much harder to learn it, right? And I think most of our difficulties in school, for example, exists because the materials in school are all presented in an external manner. So there's this, and this is connected to this. But what is the connection? The connection is external connection made from the caprice of the school system, for example. So it's actually hard to learn that which has no, which don't bother to give a proper immanent connection between the elements that constitute it, right? So it's much harder to commit to memory something which appears as a set of elements external to each other than to actually learn a principle and then derive a certain logical sequence from that principle.
I totally agree, man. It is certainly a problem that things are taught haphazardly in our modern schools. Not that they never were, but
yeah, I always had difficulty in learning some stuff, and I always thought, man, I'm fucking dumb. I remember that I was trying to learn Weber, for example, right? And then I was studying Weber, and I was always looking for the principles. I didn't know that at the time, but I had this feeling that if I learned this fundamental idea, I could get around easily because I didn't need to commit to memory a bunch of external facts, and I could simply derive his whole theory from this basic principle. What I found out is that Weber is difficult because it is a bunch of externally reunited principles which don't agree with each other, and because of that you need to commit a lot of things to memory because you won't be able to derive it, to rationally deduct it at the moment that you want.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, let's keep going. We're almost done with this.
Approaching Marburg years and maintained at least until the 1930s. As, for example, in his very early 1920 lectures, Phänomenologie der Anschauung und des Ausdrucks. Philosophy, he claims, is, quote, not some domain of things that presents an objective connection, such that rationality consists, quote, simply in the immanent illumination and experience of life itself, an illumination that remains in this experience itself, without stepping outside itself and making it into some sort of objectivity. And, quote, for philosophizing, that task, as I understand it, is simply to draw attention to something in all rigor. Not, of course, the sort of rigor that consists in determining an object in accordance with the conception of and thinking of the individual sciences, but the rigor that is prefigured by the task and goal of drawing attention. He's going to draw attention to the availability of the beings in a way that is primordial, prior to the, what he calls, gegründet, founded attempt at knowing, unquote. His words, remains in this experience itself, and drawing attention suggests a very different approach. In effect, shifting the question, how does the distinction to his question, how does the distinction between living and non-living beings emerge, become available in its significance, come to mean what it does for Dasein? This is the way Heidegger himself wants us to understand the problem in his fundamental concept of metaphysics lectures. Yet the difficulty here is not merely one of content with respect to what life as such is, but is equally and almost more emphatically a methodological one. By what path can and should we gain access to the living character of the living being in its essence? In what way should life, the animality of the animal, and the plant character of the plant be made accessible to us, unquote. And he specifies the issue further. We are thus confronted by two fundamental difficulties. One, what are we to determine the essence of life in general as? Two, how are living beings as such, the animality of the animal and the plant character of the plant, originally accessible, unquote. As we have seen, he wants to say that the meaningful availability of anything is it's available in a world, a horizon of possible meaningfulness into which any Dasein is always already historically thrown. Another crucial feature of the finitude of thought for Heidegger, and for which Heidegger thinks Hegel is inadequate to answer. So he says, let us provisionally define world as those beings which are in each case accessible and may be dealt with. Accessible in such a way that dealing with such beings is possible or necessary for any kind of being pertaining to a particular being. If that world is a medieval Christian world, living beings show up as created entities in a hierarchical order of being created by God.
Yeah.
In a scientific materialist world.
Wait.
Okay.
Wait, this is a categorical. This isn't a phenomenological description. This is a categorical description. This is what Hegel does.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, there is this beautiful passage in the Philosophy of Religion in which Hegel says that the conception that people have of God is their self-conception too, right? So what is the deal here? What is the problem? How is this like out of any Hegelian consideration here? Like, that's one of the things that you actually learn. If you think the world only through the categories of mechanism, you will come up with some Spinozian shit in the end, you know? Like, if you think the world only as life, you will try to explain everything through life and life only, etc., etc. So what is the deal here? I don't get it.
I think the idea, this is what Heidegger would be wanting to say. What he's saying is, when we disclose or find something intelligible in a certain way, we can ask the question of what is, so to speak, presupposed, such that that thing can even become intelligible in the way that it did for us.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, what are the presuppositions that come into play when I say something like, the animal is an animality
Living
in such and such a
might
sense.
show up as kinds of automata.
And so it's a critical questioning. The issue is it's just not applicable to Hegel. This is relevant when somebody's like mechanizing animals or something like that. Like that's part of the philosophical process, is getting back around behind what you presume to even say something in the first place. But Heidegger thinks that Hegel's like unaware of this or did not yet think this, whereas that self-reflexivity is actually the only content of Hegel. So it's a wrong critique. It could not be more misplaced. He's the last thing you should ever suggest.
But I really cannot believe that a man such as Heidegger would make such a bare misinterpretation. Like I believe he's smarter than me, and I was able to get it. How couldn't he?
Agendas. He was inframed in his own agenda.
Yeah, for him, that more primordial or prior to, arguably is an infinite regress, where what you have is you can just swap out lenses on things, and really that revealing concealing dynamic is the swapping of lenses on how to interpret things, and each lens is like a master signifier or something, like considering the way you consider an animal as how we've done this historically, so as part of changing views over time, almost like an empiricism about different viewpoints in history about animals. So that's one lens, versus considering it under the mechanical lens versus the organic lens, versus as a instrumental thing that I use in farming or something like that. His idea is you have different lenses that you can swap. But the thing is, all Hegel would say is, I've conceptualized every lens insofar as it's an essential categorical lens. And so you're swapping what to you appears arbitrary or contingent, like you can just swap like these indefinitely and infinitely, is a bad infinity, has a way in which it hangs together. That swapping itself is dialectical. It's not this kind of thing that you're just overcome by or like passive in respect to, and that you can only kind of have this strange kind of shepherding towards. For Hegel, it's like, no, this is rigorously logical and philosophical, dialectical, the way in which lenses move. And also, the lenses are not necessarily illegitimate, except insofar as they are abstracted
and totalized,
separated
right?
from one another, and then totalized, and then you become like metaphysically violent, where it's like you are just asserting over the actual immanent content an external interpretation. So Hegel's entire thinking of how the understanding works, what the understanding does, as well as how genuine, systematic, dialectical, spiritual philosophy actually undoes these kinds of problematics and tangles, self-solves. Hegel has the answer to this question, as well as a comprehension of how that question even happens or becomes an appearance in the first place, and how that appearance sublates itself. Hegel's got this by the bag, so to speak, and Heidegger misinterprets what he's done, and so he thinks we just have this endless finite hermeneutic of never being able to figure out what's the right perspective necessarily, or something like that.
Pretty good. Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the beauties of Hegel. Hegelian philosophy ends with a conclusion that, for the most part, the best thing to do is to let things be. But this does not mean a hands-off approach to like, oh, well, the world is what it is. Better do nothing. No, letting things be, including you actively being in the world. So your interaction is part of letting things be as well.
Yeah, the active-passive dynamic is itself a dialectic that has a beautiful resolution. Whereas, somebody like Heidegger seems to wind us up on the passive side of things, versus some others will be active in a bad way. The point is they're both producing separations and exclusions that are untenable and that self-dissolve and are untenable, yeah.
All right, let's continue.
Complex carbon-based measuring and responding devices. Heidegger suggests that viewed under the conditions of worldliness for any availability, objects like stones show up as worldless, meaningless in that sense. Animals as world poor, and Dasein as being in the world. In no case, the claim is Does anything living originally emerge for Dasein as simply an entity with a special property, being alive? Such beings emerge as plants and animals in a world where plants and animals make a certain kind of sense. Such a world is historical and contingent, another mark of the finitude of thinking. That is, we know the patterns of the behavior of animals. We know that certain aspects of a world do show up for it as meaningful, others don't. And what shows up is already imbricated in its specific world, significantly set by its species form. Other animals show up as prey or predator or even neither. That's just as significant. We know that we share this responsiveness with them, especially because we are either predator or prey with respect to a number of animals. Even though animals are said to be world poor, they are, Heidegger says, captured or captivated benomen by their simple species requirements, responsive in a differentiated way, but not open to anything than what such requirements demand. Even though that's true, he says, we are nevertheless able to share some aspects of that world and availability with many animals. They are available to us by virtue of this sharing. We understand them not primarily by observation, nor by imagining their lives, but by, Heidegger says, living with them, mitgehe, going along with, in the aspects of the world that we share. Heidegger is well aware that his approach looks circular. To sum up, then, we find ourselves moving in a circle when we presuppose a certain fundamental conception concerning both the essence of life and the way in which it is to be interpreted, and then proceed on the basis of this presupposition to open a path which will lead us to a fundamental conception of life, which in some sense we've already assumed. It is only by assuming that animal life becomes available to us in a distinct way, the way anything can be said to be available in a world, that the notion of the world and world poverty can illuminate animal life. But Heidegger claims that such circling is intrinsic to all philosophy, that the circling allows us to see what is at the center of the circle. In this case, how the question of the meaning of any being must be approached in the light of the meaning of being itself, such a world-dependent manifestability, something Heidegger will go on to analyze as he wants to say, an event, an Ereignis, and so an essentially temporal historical phenomenon. That's the basis of the claim that treating life as a pure concept has ignored the prior question of how living beings, particularly animal beings, could be available, manifested meaningfully to a world-dependent being like Dasein in the first place. This is a complicated issue in Hegel because it introduces the relationship in his encyclopedia between life as a logical concept and life as it figures in the philosophy of nature. But that doesn't affect Heidegger's point. The emergence of life in the philosophy of nature is still understood as a concept that plays a specific role within a natural scientific account of the beings, all now understood within the domain of speculative logic, understood properly. And Heidegger's point about what is forgotten is still preserved. So, section 5, forgetfulness. Of course, the science of logic is not a phenomenology of lived experience. Hegel wrote a phenomenology, of course, in 1807, but that's a highly idealized and systematic treatment of experience, where that word is taken in a technical sense by him. But this is not a case of apples and oranges comparisons. Heidegger claims that Hegel's account leaves out, forgets, a crucial condition of its own possibility, original availability of living beings in a way true to the dependence of such emergence on the availability of the meaning of being in general. Hegel, it is claimed, dogmatically assumes, along with the Western rationalist tradition, that this availability is discursive intelligibility, being available as the content of an assertoric judgment, understood in the special way Hegel wants us to understand speculative judgments, but nevertheless, Urteil, judgments. The speculative judgments of the logic are truth bearers, not because they correspond to beings, but because they are true to the concept, are internally necessary for any thinking to have determinate objects at all. But pure thinking's only...
I still disagree with this, in which, for example, like I gave the example already with the eye, but this works fine. The fact that you're in vision, you have the determinations of light, darkness, colors, then spatial objects with contours, shades. These are existential judgments. Your eye, your eye is making these differentiated unities in being the thing that it is. These don't have to be conceptual judgments. Later on, and it's exactly what Heidegger is doing as well. Like, I don't understand what the issue is, because Heidegger is giving this explanation, which is a meta explanation of how things happen. And then it seems to me the complaint is just an unfair one, because then he says, well, look, Hegel's saying here that, everything is to be understood conceptually. Well, yeah. And you're saying that everything's supposed to be understood hermeneutically. But of course, most people are not going around understanding things hermeneutically. Oh, I'm doing hermeneutics. No, they're just doing it. The same thing. People are not walking around like, oh, I got concepts and judgments in my head. They're just doing it. What's the problem? I don't understand.
I think the most basic problem here for me as a logic fan here is that they are throwing all these determinations and they are not caring to give a philosophical account of it. Contingency, finitude, limit, this, reason, world, etc., etc., etc. It's always being thrown out like as if we actually had a proper content of this conception. And if it is impossible to give a proper content to these conceptions, well, there is no discussion. There is no need to discussion. There is nothing to discuss, fundamentally.
Yeah, what is it? Henselt says that he thinks Heidegger is right, that he's doing phenomenology, but he's not doing philosophy, and so Henselt doesn't care what he's doing. By the way, Henselt is a guy. I think he's a PhD grad student in Germany. Hegelian, very interesting person.
Object is itself. And even in this case, Heidegger would want to ask how pure thinking itself comes to be available to mean what it does to Dasein. Hegel wants to say this is possible simply by thinking, that what he calls the resolve to think, and reflecting on thinking, since thinking is a productive capacity. But Heidegger wants to say that the attempt at pure thinking, that resolve, as Hegel says, to think, itself always occurs already in a world at a time, in a way that such a resolve has come to mean what it does in that world. For example, in Hegel's world, it means a liberation from the understanding, a way out of an unfree self-understanding. But it just happens to mean that. And speculative judgments cannot be the primary truth bearers, because any judgmental determining already presupposes a disclosure, a meaningful availability of what is to be judged about. Truth is instead to be understood originally as this unconcealing disclosure, aletheia. Now, this availability for Heidegger, just by the rationale behind his charge of a logical prejudice, must insist, as he does, that such availability is preconceptual, non-discursive in his so-called phenomenological period. The covering term for this mode of access, as we've seen, is Stimmung, attunement, being attuned. In being attuned, in being in time, the privileged mode of attuned disclosure of the meaning of Dasein's being is famously anxiety. In the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, he shows how profound or existential boredom can be another attunement, which puts us on to the contingent manifestability of the meaning of being itself by its failure. Later, and I think here is the most significant, starting with roughly around.
I just want to explain a little bit about what Heidegger is attempting to articulate right now, or what Pippin is articulating about Heidegger. And it's very simple, actually. The idea here is that of pre-reflective experience, where it's like, so you have your experience, and then you reflect upon it, but because the reflection is not directly that pre-reflective experience, how can my reflection get back to the content of the pre-reflective experience? So it seems like there's an essential gap. And this is basically the Schelling thing, where it's like my existence precedes my ability to conceptualize or produce this circle, so to speak. The easy argument to give here is like, how do you know that exists?
Yeah.
If you really think about it, because what you're doing is you're saying there's a distinction, and I know there's a distinction. So you have to at once be over there and over in the reflective part in order to even say that or think that. So you're automatically helping yourself to the thing you're saying you're supposed to be barred to. So you've immediately hooked up. And even if you gave them the distinction, it's like, okay, either I'm in experience or I'm in reflection. If I'm in reflection, this is a perfect totality unto itself that I have perfect access to. Or if I'm in experience, then this is a perfect totality unto itself which I have access to. So there should be no distinction at all. But if you grant the distinction, then you're automatically in the place which recognizes the distinction as such. And I think a philosopher can just say that is the reflective comprehension, raising the thought of and making explicit of what was implicit.
Yeah. What I find interesting here is that what he just said that about the resolve to think, and that this resolve to think was already conditioned by what resolve to think actually meant at Hegel's time to his individuality. That also applies to what he is saying, if that's the case. That's the problem with all this finitude talk. They are always like jumping out of finitude to talk about finitude, but finitude is always about the other, right? Like the conceptions that Heidegger used, such as Stimmung or anything like that, attunement. No, those seems to be like final categories, final conceptions, which are out of that which they are used to say that there's nothing out of it. You know what I mean? I don't know if I expressed myself.
Yep.
Yeah. Like the finitude is always the think of the other. My thinking is not finite. It reminds me of those guys who are always walking around saying that everybody's sociologically determinate, but their own judgment of the why and how their other people are sociologically determinate. You know, that's a feeling that I always had with these philosophies of finitude. Like the finite is the other. But I am establishing a absolute standpoint about finitude here, you know, which is not under the subordination of the conditions that I say that it is.
Yep, that's if you know the argument. Like anytime they make a distinction, like a finite philosopher does this, a distinction between the finite and the infinite or something like that. It's like, where are you such that you have a perfect access to this distinction, such that you know that we are limited in such a way? Because they automatically have to be claiming something absolute. You can do this with any finite philosopher, and it's literally it's just a 1-2 punch. It's almost trivial to give this critique. Like, if you understand Sextus Empiricus's 5 modes, you're done as far as finite philosophy goes. You know how to whip them all effortlessly. Like, because it comes down to something. It's always something that's simple. They can get very complicated, but at bottom they'll end up saying something stupid like that, and you could just whoop. And then you just, oh, good. Now I can go do the science of logic.
Good point. To something he said a couple minutes ago about the accessibility of being, the accessibility of thinking. I don't know why that's a problem. I see how that's maybe a problem if you assume that there is no such thing as historical development. In which case, you're like, well, why this category appears here, and why does it appear over there, and why do we have more advanced categories here supposedly, and why do we have inferior categories over there? Okay, maybe that's a question, but to just ask, where did the value of thinking come from? It's always been valuable. When isn't it? And when isn't it that people are existent who will just think for the pleasure of thinking? I mean, when Aristotle says philosophy begins with wonder, that's true. You won't come out like, oh, well, what is being out of the gate? But some people do have that just automatic, well, not automatic, but what is it? Tendency towards a sense of wonder, which gets them just naturally thinking. You know, that's how the natural philosophers came about. They weren't thinking about pure thought determinations. You know, they're like, oh, well, you know, everything is fire, everything is water, everything is earth. And then there's people down, like, who come beyond that, and they're like, and they also have that tendency towards the wonder of thinking. And they also just have, like, these moments in which, like, I mean, it's happened to us all here, right? Like, you just have epiphanies one day, out of the blue, about, like, random things sometimes. And it's like, wow, it just strikes you, like, oh, that's that way. And you keep going with it. And so plenty of people also come about, just like, they have epiphanies, and suddenly that strikes them very strongly, and then they follow the path of thinking. And then there's a contingency to that, of course. Certainly, you know, not everybody's doing this. Not everybody is born with the tendencies to want to do this or to enjoy this. Not everybody's born with a condition socially in which, like, they could even have the time to develop this. But there have been people who have, and that's enough to, like, lead a certain very very stable tradition of thought, which connects across various cultures who are all interested in these generalized questions in various ways, and which have discourses with each other across time and in space and across languages. And they find an interest in each other, and they develop these things in certain ways. You know, one may as well ask, well, why? I think it would be more interesting to ask, well, why did idealism appear, you know, in Greece? Why didn't it appear in Egypt? Why didn't it appear in India? Well, that would be a contingent question, right? You know, there's a lot of contingent factors to it. But nonetheless, once it happens, it's real. It's there. Other people clearly find it intelligible. Other people clearly find it of interest. And this drives the development on its own account further. So I don't know why that's a question. Like, oh, well, where's the original availability of thinking? In the fact that we're thinking beings who find thinking to be, you know, are just the way in that when we get into it, it really is just part of what we are. Once you become conscious of it, just like, well, yeah, of course, everyone's always thinking to a more or less extent. Some people think just a hell of a lot more, you know, like philosophers. That's it. Thinking always has some kind of availability to us.
But you can also ask for the availability of the question of the availability of thinking. And you can also ask for the availability of the question of the availability of availability. You know what I mean? Like, it's endless. It's endless. What I feel all about that is all those questions that are thrown to Hegel could be thrown to Heidegger's own fundamental ontology, you know, which seems to present itself as a final exposition of design, you know. I don't know, man.
Yep. Let's finish this.
Please.
The introduction to metaphysics. Later, the experience of artworks can serve as the occasion for such disclosure. Now, this all begins to take us far afield from the problem of life. But in consideration of all this, the Hegelian idea that we should primarily understand the meaning of the concept of life as the pure concept necessary to resolve the aporia generated by the attempt to think mechanism and chemism through to their necessary sublation or the overcoming of a potential incoherence, does not seem to have much to do with what is proximally and for the most part the original meaning of living being in human experience. Now, the reference to human experience may suggest a reversion to a form of empiricism or psychology or philosophical anthropology, a possibility that gives Heidegger a great deal of anxiety himself, which he always is trying to object to. But Heidegger wants to rescue a phenomenology of meaning from empiricism, to reclaim the notion of what it is like for Dasein as a hermeneutical enterprise, not an empirical one. The availability of anything from pure thinking to living being involves an interpretive engagement all the way down, where the latter phrase is meant to deny the model of the projection of an interpretation onto a putatively uninterpreted thing. There are no such available.
Oh, I guess that's another interpretation.
So Hegel can launch and perhaps even complete the
Yep.
science of pure thinking and claim some ontological relevance for it. Here we come to the question of whether this matters. But he cannot claim that the concept, that model of intelligibility and determinate being, is the absolute. This is not a result, something like the demarcation of a regional ontology, that which and only that which could be a fit subject for discursive assertion. It can't be a kind of resolution that either Hegel or Heidegger would accept. Hegel, because it is unsystematic and would leave unclarified the relation between such a region and any other region. In fact, the result would preclude there being such a question. And Heidegger, because it would still be the case that such a region, supposedly isolatable, presupposed some availability of the meaning of being and living being, and would leave that dependence unclarified. But even so, that may be the most consistent result of taking on board Heidegger's concerns. Thank you very much. That's it.
Well, funnily enough, I think he canceled out the entire inquiry right here at the end.
What?
Because he brought up that the two things aren't even about the same thing, so how in the world are you going to even be crossing the question? If Heidegger's interest is just in the ways in which human beings phenomenally could frame any given thing, that's just a finite empirical question about various things. And then, and then particularly, of course, he's not interested in the particular finite ways, but he's interested in just like the general form of the inframing phenomenology of anything. What does this have to do with the ontological category of life as a logical category?
What I think
immediately nothing, right?
Yeah.
Because the examples given, for example, like he said, okay, well, in the industrial age, life may be just some kind of like mechanical, advanced mechanical self-reproducing machine. Okay, but if you're in the Middle Ages, life is a creative being, a product of God. Well, what the fuck does that have to do with the ontological, logical category of life? Those are two different, distinct operations.
What I think is going on here is like Heidegger is, or Pippin's Heidegger, is somehow saying that there is no such a thing as showing the necessity of the specific particular content that Hegel gives to the category of life, as opposed to other contents that this category may have. So we are in this intertextual world in which we go and we have these fundamental assumptions about the world, and there is no such a thing as going out of this net of fundamental assumptions to show the necessity of the content of a certain concept.
Yeah, I think sorry.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think what Heidegger would be saying is that, depending on the fundamental assumptions, which are apparently arbitrary, contingent, historical, variable, swappable, you can produce different logics, quote unquote, of a thing, because the assumptions just kind of roll out like that, so to speak. So Hegel can do his thing, but it cannot be absolute. It's just what happens with an arbitrary, almost like a choice, or whatever epoch you're swirling in has caught your the intelligibility of your world, and you can carry out the result of those assumptions, so to speak, or the givenness, or whatever you'd want to call it, the grantedness of that revealing. What you can say is Hegel is, well, here's one account, here's another account. They purport to be about the same thing, actually, and I can distinguish the two accounts from one another, and I can relate them. I can cognize, distinguish, and relate. And it turns out they have overlapping contents that are regarding themselves as mutually exclusive, but also relating themselves to one another, or giving themselves priority over the other in some such way, because the medieval account of life says this about life, and this other account says this about life. They're talking about the same thing, because that's what they both purport to be talking about. They say they converge. Like, they're literally just, these different accounts are just automatically connecting themselves. So it's not like you have different contingent logics you can unfold arbitrarily. It's that we're not attending to the logic of the different contingently assumed logics and how they hang together as a whole. You just have these different random lenses or hermeneutic holes you can engage with, rather than engage with the engagement of all of them, which is what Heidegger would want to do, because he wants to be getting back around all the time and getting away from getting trapped in one of those empirical practices. So like, we're not always reducible to sociology or this or that other science. He doesn't see that Hegel did what he wanted to do already.
What I find interesting is that everything that Heidegger says do not apply to himself.
Yep.
Like, he's out of it. He has a certain basic fundamental ontological categories, which are like the ways that design relates to the world, absolutely, right? And is this historical too? Is his another framework, conceptual framework, arbitrary, contingent? It doesn't seem so.
Yeah, I mean, if he thought it was, I don't know why he would put it forward as anything special.
Yeah, that's always the what's the word I'm looking for? It's funny, because you encounter this with a lot of people who are articulating things that are like finite philosophies. There's one way in which it sees itself as being very tolerant or open-minded or something like that. It's almost like self-flagellating, where because I have not asserted something, or because I have this kind of fundamental openness, I can entertain a plurality. I can be a cosmopolitan about views and things like that. And so I don't leave anybody's claim off the table, so to speak. I can entertain everybody, entertain all their thoughts and stuff. So it sounds like it's a nice collectivist kind of thing. But what happens is, when somebody says something that they're actually asserting as real, they say, you cannot do that. It is all finite and relative. But now they're making an assertion about what another person can assert. And so it feels or seems tolerant, but it accomplishes the opposite, because views are exclusive, actually. And the only way to actually get through that and find what is legit is to work out the view that excludes basically falsehood and includes only truth. And that's the navigation of all these different views.
Very good point.
That's an interesting point. Like, I've always felt that with people who cling to this absolutization of difference, like, they cannot cope with the fact that most conceptual frameworks do not include their arbitrary asserted criteria of tolerance, right? Tolerance cannot be defended in reasoned grounds, because everything is historical contingent. So I can simply say, well, okay, like Winfield says, I can be a postmodern fascist, in which I simply accept the arbitrariness of a certain standpoint, but I have this will to power to realize it in the world. And no one has any reason whatsoever to say that I'm wrong, because tolerance itself cannot, it's not a concept that I, in my cynic and pseudo skeptic standpoint assume, right? So the difference between a postmodern fascist and a postmodern, I would use this word, this damn word postmodern, but I think you get what I'm saying here, like contingency, finitude, everything is relative, blah, blah, blah. In the end, like, the difference between a postmodern fascist and a postmodern liberal is only a matter of temperament, you know? Because
Yeah.
you can be a fucking postmodern fascist who says, well, there is no foundation, there is no universal, everything is particular. Well, I will get this concept of a national unity based on shared values and traditions, and I will try to affirm it in the world, and fuck you. And the postmodern liberal has no answer for that, but their beautiful soul full of beautiful intentions, you know, nothing else. Because they cannot, on rational ground, oppose it. And if those people think that rational grounds are not important for people, you know, they're deluded. They have deluded themselves. They have actually like fucking destroyed their heads with bad French theory, man.
Yep. Anyways,
Like
guys.
I tell you, bad theory is worse than crack, guys. Be careful. Take care.
Yeah, it can. A fucked up way of thinking leads to a fucked up way of being. But anyways, we've been going for 3 hours. Shorter than I thought it would be, amazingly. So, yeah, I think this was very good. We had a lot of interesting points to make. I think other people will definitely find this of interest. So, for those of you listening, Heidegger was wrong. That's all there is to it.
Well,
See ya.
we are going to get some backfire on that, dude. Okay, bye, guys. Oh, Heidegger was not wrong. Everything is contingent and historical. So, he being not wrong is he being wrong. So, yeah.
Sorry, I will not be inframed by Heidegger's frame. I refuse. I am a
refuse. I
free
prefer absoluteness of ontoteleological philosophy.
I think I will assert my freedom and say I prefer not to. All right. Goodbye.